Hello, I am Kirsten Thea, your reporter for today's topic. Here, let me ask you, how many of you can speak two languages? Well, all of us can speak two languages. We are in the Philippines after all, where English is one of the most prominent language that people are using. But let me ask you this. How many of you would say that you are completely fluent in two languages? Not all of us. Why is that? I think we can all agree that being fluent in two languages is a good thing. It creates additional job prospects. It allows us to talk to more people. It also has been linked to several cognitive and social advantages, and it delays the onset of Alzheimer's disease, says Nadia Ramirez. But why are we not all fluent bilinguals? So our topic for this morning is language development and language allocation in bilingual education. To have another language is to possess a second soul. Language shapes the way we think. We have our mother tongue and our second language. It is in our mother tongue the way we think, and that language shapes our thinking. But our second language needs to also be as good as the first language, for our second language is our second soul. Learning new languages brings new horizon, and it improves our memory and makes us flexible and creative. It gives us more opportunities, and it feels good to be fluent in your second language, right? A new language is like a new life. Bilingualism is the ability to communicate in two different languages. Bilingualism is the ability to communicate fluently in a language other than your native language. As our world becomes more global, we also become increasingly bilingual. The mixing of cultures leads to bilingualism. Specifically, exposure to languages can influence the development of bilingualism. A person can become bilingual with dedication and practice of the language. Often, individuals who decide to become bilingual do so because of its many benefits. Back in our elementary or high school days, we are forced to speak English inside the classroom, right? Because there's a penalty for using our mother tongue. Piso for one word, so one sentence could lead to 10 pesos or 15 pesos. In that way, I think I learned speaking English is important in education. Languages are learned most readily during the toddler and preschool years, and to a lesser extent during elementary school. Therefore, children growing up in bilingual homes and or receiving bilingual education easily acquire both languages. Throughout much of the world, bilingualism is the norm for both children and adults. Regarding the acquisition of language in one native language, early signs of communication occur when infants realize that their vocal action cause interactions with others, including their parents. For example, communication occurs when an infant cries and understands that this will lead to them getting food or comfort. Young babies begin to recognize the voice of their caretaker or mothers. Babies develop the ability to sort speech sounds that make up words in their language. Usually at the age of 6 months, babies recognize simple sounds from their native language. Language acquisition is very similar for monolingual and bilingual children, although some experts view bilingualism as a specialized case of language development. Children growing up in homes where two different languages are spoken usually acquire both languages simultaneously. When one thinks a bilingual individual, they often think of someone who is equally proficient in both languages. But the reality is that bilingual individuals are rarely equally proficient in both languages. What may consider a balanced bilingual or someone who is equally proficient in both languages is very much a myth, as one language is typically dominant over the other. Bilingual language learners proceed through the same patterns of language and speech development as children acquiring a single language per Garcia O. 2009. However, the development of speech and language skills are often varies in children. Typically, developing children acquire language by following a natural progression when they master skills. There are two major patterns of bilingual language development, both occurring before the age of 3. In the early stages of simultaneous bilingual language development, a child may mix words, parts of words, and inflections from both languages in a single sentence. Children growing up in homes where two different languages are spoken usually acquire both languages simultaneously, although their acquisition of each language may be somewhat slower than that of children who are acquiring a single language. The second stage of bilingual language development, at the age of 4 or older, children gradually begin to distinguish between the two languages and use them separately, sometimes depending on where they are. One language may be used less formally to talk about home and family, whereas the other language may be used more formally, perhaps for relating events that took place outside the home. Often, children find it easier to express a specific idea in one language rather than the other. Bilingual children also go through periods when one language is used more than the other. Some children may begin to prefer one language over the other, particularly if that language is spoken more frequently in their home or school. Bilingual language development usually proceeds more smoothly when both languages are introduced early and simultaneously. When the parents each use a different language with their child, the child is less likely to experience language confusion. This is because the first language may influence the way in which they learn and use their second language. Learning the second language is easier for children if the sounds, words, and vocabulary of the languages are similar. Advantages of bilingualism. Bilingualism has been reported to improve the following skills: verbal and linguistic abilities, general reasoning, concept formation, divergent thinking, metalinguistic skills, the ability to analyze and to talk about language and control other language processing. So these abilities are important for reading development in young children and may be a prerequisite for later learning to read and write in a new language. These signs of possible language delay in bilingual children include the following: not making sounds between 2 and 6 months of age, fewer than one word per week in children aged 6 to 15 months, fewer than 20 words in the two languages combined by 20 months of age, limited vocabulary without word combinations in children aged 2 to 3 years of age, prolonged periods without using speech, difficulty remembering words, and missing normal milestones of language development in the first language of a sequentially bilingual child. If a bilingual child has a speech or language problem, it should be apparent in both languages. However, detecting language delay or abnormalities in bilingual children can be very difficult. So these signs, you can see these signs if you know that your child has a language problem. Bilingual education in the 21st century. Bilingual education takes on many different forms and increasingly in the complexity of the modern world includes forms where two or more languages are separated for instruction, but also forms where two or more languages are used together in complex combinations. Now let's discuss the language policies in the Philippines. Colonial policies, education and English. While the Spanish ruled the country, one means of control was to limit access to language and education except for the elite ilustrado class that was generally composed of wealthy Filipinos who were economically and socially positioned to conform with and support Spanish colonial agendas. Only to this class was access to the Spanish language given while the rest remained uneducated in language and everything else in general. Much has been written about Spanish colonization in the Philippines, but what matters is the fact that language was a means to divide the rich and poor. Unlike the Spanish, the Americans knew right away that education was a powerful weapon in their colonial arsenal. In the Philippines, the Americans found ideal colonial subjects who were receptive to the opportunities given by English, the most potent weapon of the colonial government. It was therefore easy for the Americans to bring English to the Philippines because of the positive attitude of Filipinos toward Americans and the incentives given to Filipinos to learn English in terms of career opportunities, government service, and politics. The Philippines gained independence from the US in 1946, but there was no independence from English. Bernardo 2004 writes that even though there were studies at the time that showed the positive effects of using local languages in education, there was no altering of the dominant position of English. However, because of the positive results of a few studies on mother tongue education, the Philippine government decided on a formula for language in education that involved local languages being used up to the second grade and English as the medium of instruction from third grade onward. This formula of local languages for primary school and English therefore promoted a split between the language of home and childhood and the language of the larger world, English, in adulthood. The most important development was the formal introduction of a bilingual education policy, BEP, that stipulated the use of English for science and mathematics and Filipino was to be used for all other courses. This is a system promoting a stable diglossia with English as the language of global developments and Filipino as the language of national identity. Gonzalez, 1998. The BEP, or Bilingual Education Policy, though, was eventually blamed for what Filipinos considered to be a deterioration in literacy, as if learning in another language could wither away a Filipino's child learning. Bilingual education had marginal success, with English still dominant and resulting in Filipinos fearing an English-deprived future. The 1974 government, under President Ferdinand Marcos, released an advertisement in the New York Times equating Filipino cheap labors with English. The ad said, "We like multinationals. Local staff, clerks with a college education start at $35. Accountants come for $67. Executive secretaries for $148. Our labor force speaks your language." By 1974, the shaping of the Philippine colonial mind was complete as the Philippine government itself was shaping national aspirations that were aligned with American needs. Today, with the Philippine economy largely dependent on remittances from overseas workers, many of whom work in English-speaking countries, the link between cheap labor and English is as strong as ever. In the 1987 BEP, Filipino was mandated to be the language of literacy and the language of scholarly discourse, while English was described as the international language and the non-exclusive language of science and technology by Bernardo 2004. In this new bilingual provision, the functions of the two languages were more formally split into Filipino for local purposes and English for global purposes. However, Gonzalez and Bernardo point out that because of economic advantages, English has remained as the most dominant language of literacy, despite efforts to widen the domains of Filipino. Other reasons are the controlling domains of English in Philippine life that includes politics, business, and the law. This split between local Filipino and global English remains an important element in the perception of the place of different language in the Philippine life. In recent decades, more fears of an English-deprived future have surfaced mainly through a stronger need for Filipinos to fill global jobs. President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo pushed for aligning Philippine educational goals with global needs. What Arroyo wanted was for the educational sector to keep producing graduates who would fill labor positions all over the world. So this is what the former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo said. Ang importante kung ano yung nakikita nating demand sa mga skills. Ang ating school system ay dapat produce ng produce. Kung malaki ang demand sa nurses, produce more nurses. Kung malaki ang demand sa IT workers, produce more IT workers. Kasi kailangan din natin sila dito. Kailangan sa ibang bansa. Arroyo 2002. Since the ability to use English is an important skill for a global workforce, Arroyo's position led to fears that bilingual education caused the weakening of Filipinos' English skills and consequently the chance to work abroad. In addition, the need for English was exacerbated by the business processing outsourcing or the BPO industry, which set up major English using call centers and customer service hotlines in the Philippines, Lockwood 2009. In a country with high unemployment, the BPO industry, with its promise of a 38% growth naturally further led to the pragmatic connection between English and employability. Authored by Congressman Gunigundo, the bill he proposed this bill. The strong teaching of English and Filipino in the elementary grades, but only as separate subjects and not a media of instruction. So, if Filipinos can learn literacy skills in their native language or mother tongue, then learning English and other skills demanded by global labor requirements will not be a problem. Today, in the new K-12 curriculum of the Philippines, mother tongue education is quickly gaining ground, with schools all over the country now required to use mother tongues in the early years education. All Filipinos know that their home language or vernacular or Filipino will not give them access to international relations, trade, and business. Moreover, they also realize the value of education and the value of competence in English for their education, not only within their own country, but especially outside the country. The prospects of further study abroad and even work abroad continue to be attractive and a motivator for learning English and maintaining competence in English, not only as an individual but above all as a society. By Gonzalez, 2009. So the linguistic divide between the rich and the poor that was seen during the Spanish colonization is still around in a revised form. Now, the idea is if you do not know English, you remain poor. The stable diglossia between English, Filipino, and other local languages is even more visible as English is now, more than ever, packaged as the language of opportunity. In 2001, Topas wrote that linguistic imperialism in the Philippines is not a thing of the past, and English still enjoys a dominant position in the minds and hearts of Filipinos who want to fulfill their economic dreams by working abroad. American colonialism first cemented this link between language and economic opportunities. But history tells us that Philippine government policies of business and labor have continued to support the status quo through its prioritizing of global labor needs, whether by offering English-speaking Filipinos as overseas workers or as local customer service workers for overseas firms. Now these questions remain. With mother tongue-based education, will the Philippines see a lessening of the gap between the rich and the poor, a gap that language policies have helped maintain? How do Filipinos perceive the roles of their languages? What are their perception and attitudes? Thank you so much for listening.